Hi everyone, this is Svava Brooks, your host for the Take Your Power Back interview series. I know how hard it is to find the right tools and the resources to heal from the effects of abuse. And that's why I started this series, interviewing wonderful experts and professionals who are willing to share their unique approach to healing and thriving after childhood trauma. So today, let's get started. I'm interviewing a very special person, Dr. Howard Fradkin. Welcome, Howard.
Thank you.
So good to have you. I was just chatting with you, telling you how much I appreciate all the work that you do. And I want to tell our audience a little more about you before we go into our questions. Dr. Fradkin has counseled over 1,500 male survivors as a psychologist and as a co-chairperson of the Male Survivor Weekends of Recovery, and trained over 2,500 colleagues on male sexual victimization. Dr. Fradkin's first book, Joining Forces, Empowering Male Survivors to Thrive, was published by Hay House in November 2012. I like how it says first book, right? There's more coming, I bet. Dr. Right? Yes, no, I'm sure you have a lot to say on this topic. Dr. Fradkin is recognized as an expert for media in the US and Canada who want their listeners to understand more about male sexual victimization. He has been featured as an expert in Oprah Winfrey, that groundbreaking show where 200 male survivors stood up in that. There was 2 episodes that I can still remember that. It was quite amazing. And that was in November 2010, correct?
Yes.
And you've also been on Dr. Phil, Katie, Huffington Post TV, and many national syndicated and local radio shows. I mean, your bio just goes on and on. I've heard you speak on panels and as a keynote at some big trauma conferences. And I know also you're doing a lot of work now with the military about the sexual, abuse of men in the military. So that's another important dialogue that's kind of coming forward in our culture. So you clearly have a big heart and a deep passion for this topic and wanting to help people. So can you just start with sharing with our audience, where does this come from?
Well, my passion starts from my own story of being sexually abused as a child and as an adult. And at first, when I started training to be a psychologist, I really was pretty much unaware of it.
Oh, wow.
I basically had glossed over a whole bunch of it, not really forgotten it to some degree or repressed it, but as importantly, just sort of being in denial about what I experienced. I was writing letters to my perpetrators, my parents, describing what wonderful parents they were and how I was working with these people who were very traumatized and had difficult relationships and how grateful I was. And so it took some major shifts for me and some incredibly gifted psychologists and therapists and body workers who were able to help me come to terms and understand what had been done to me and the effects of it and how it had transformed my life in a negative way. And so I had to do a lot of work to become the man that I am now. And through that work that I was doing, I met a lot of other male survivors, and really I could never be where I am without all of their help. And so what I learned through that process is that if men want to heal, if any survivor wants to heal, but in this case men,
yes,
that they have to be talking to other men, other male survivors who've been through similar experiences, who can both support each other and also challenge each other. A lot of times what really helped me was some of my friends going, you really need to look at this, or you need to look at this pattern of behavior. And so that was really important to me in terms of developing this passion and understanding the power of community.
Wow.
And that's a lot of what I believe today, is that in order to heal, we have to do it in community.
Wow, that's beautiful. Can you speak a little bit, do you think, how common that is? Because, I'm sure you've run into other colleagues who have similar stories, who had forgotten or repressed or put it aside in any which way we cope until at some turning point in our lives, those memories come up. I mean, how common is that?
Well, I think it's very common, especially with men. Many men who are survivors of sexual victimization have not coded what was done to them as abuse. Some of them, like a lot of men, will, if I ask about what was your first sexual experience, they'll tell me, and their first sexual experience, in my mind, was clearly abusive. You know, it was they were 7 and the person was 15 or 16, or they were 10 and the person was 18 or 20, or so a lot of times, or they were, 1.5 or 2, and it was their mother or their father. So there are all sorts of scenarios, but it's very typical that people don't really understand, because oftentimes offenders, perpetrators will say things like, I care about you, I love you. And so it gets very confusing for a man or boy who's been abused when somebody's saying, and this is the classic Jerry Sandusky's story, right?
Yes.
He told them how much he cared about them, how he wanted to help them. And then, of course, once you're groomed, then it's very difficult to accept there's another reality, which is this person does not love you. This is not love at all. This is abuse.
Yes.
This is harm.
Yeah, that's powerful. I like how you frame it, that they have not coded it, or it has not been coded. It's like, we can't become survivors or thrivers unless we have accepted the damage or the truth of what happened. Is that what you mean when you say coded?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
And there's a specific word I've been using, what is done to me. And I make this a big deal because language really affects how we code and how we work through our abuse. And a lot of times survivors talk about what happened to them, and I probably will slip into it during this interview. But I really make it a point to tell survivors, this is not a happening. Tornadoes are happening, volcanoes are happening, earthquakes are happening. Sexual abuse is a choice that somebody else makes who has power and authority over you, and oftentimes knows about your vulnerabilities and takes advantage of that. And so it's not a choice at all. Yeah, it's a choice. I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. It's a choice that somebody else makes.
That's right.
Our choice, and we weren't at the wrong place at the wrong time.
Exactly.
That somebody decided to do because they picked us.
That's beautiful. And do you think, I appreciate you really making that clear, because I think the language about healing is so important, but I think our culture is not helpful because there's a lot of victimization, re-victimization, I think that happens around, especially for males, and I want to hear you mention that. We'll talk about that a little bit, but like you say, in that moment, someone took your power, right? And that's what we're talking about here. How do we take our power back? Exactly. It was in that moment, something was done to you, it was, like you said, you didn't just happen to be there, and it was very premeditated, right?
Yes.
In terms of how you were groomed. And so, yeah, I really appreciate you emphasizing that.
And I think that when survivors, I ask men who are working with me, when they say what happened to me when I was 7, I ask them, let me ask you to say it in a different way, and I want you to notice what happens in your body when you say, I was raped, or this was done to me when I was 7, and just see what that feels like, where in your body it changes, versus when you say, what happened to me when I was 7, because it just reinforces all the wrong messages. And I think when we're clear that this wasn't something that was our fault, that's the primary reason. That the shame is that, well, it happened to me, versus realizing there's no shame because I wasn't responsible. This is somebody else's choice.
Exactly. And that's the shame piece, right? It's like,
exactly,
you're groomed by the shame is put on you to silence you, because you're made to believe that somehow it was your fault. Like you're the cause of it. And that will silence anybody, not just children.
Right, exactly. And as we know from physiology, a lot of times people who are abused may indeed experience some pleasure in the process because our bodies respond. A lot of times guys say their body betrayed them. When I was on Oprah with Tyler Perry, he talked about that, how he felt like his body had betrayed him because he was feeling something feeling pleasure and knowing that this was not an experience he wanted. And so I think that it's really important to just be very conscious that that confuses us and makes us go, well, wait a minute. And of course, perpetrators then say, well, look, you have an erection, or you had an orgasm, so you must have wanted this.
Exactly.
And of course, the truth is nobody wants to be abused.
No, exactly. And not by someone we loved, we trusted, we thought it was our friend. I mean, not ever, but I'm just saying
Right.
the added trauma, betrayal trauma on top of someone invading you so personally, and then as a child, you're hardwired. The sensory system, when it gets aroused through sexuality, it's like giving children access to information they don't know what to do with. It does terrible burden, terrible harm, and then yes, it confuses people for the rest of their lives until they can, like you say, code it into the reality of what really happened, and then start to sort it out. No, it was done to you.
Yeah.
So
the other word that I wanted to respond to you just used was the word betrayal.
Yes.
And I think that that's a primary thing for survivors to understand, that their trust was betrayed.
Yes.
And what makes that so difficult is that once your trust is betrayed, especially by somebody who said they cared, who said they loved you, who were in a protective role with you, like you mentioned, the military work I'm doing. And here we have our soldiers who are in military academies, and soldiers who are serving alongside their fellow soldiers, commanders, officers. A quarter of those survivors have been perpetrated by somebody in the chain of command. So, it's massive betrayal.
Yes.
That the brothers, their commanders, their officers took advantage of them and manipulated them and groomed them.
Yes.
Same thing with priest survivors, with anybody who's been any kind of clergy abuse. I mean, it's the same thing.
Yes, yes. And what a terrible setup, when someone that you have experienced or you think is trustworthy, then you go out there and you trust no one.
That's exactly right. And that's the primary thing for people to understand. And that's what makes therapy so difficult, is that people are really hesitant to engage and ask for help because, if the person that supposedly loves you hurts you, then why would you trust anybody else? Why would I get involved in any kind of emotional, intimate relationship? I'm just going to get hurt again.
That's right. That's right.
It's tragic, and thankfully survivors can heal, they can thrive, they can get through this, but it takes a lot of support.
Yes, it does. And I love what you said about, the group, like we need community to heal from this. I'm a big fan of, support groups and group workshops as well. And I want to talk more about that and have you share more about your book. But I'm curious, in your experience, what do you think separates the male survivors from the female survivors? It's, since you have both that personal experience and you probably have worked with both men and women. So
Absolutely.
What insights can you share with us?
Well, I think one of the major differences is socialization. So when a man or male or boy is abused, all the socialization messages are about you have to be strong, you have to be powerful, you should be in control. And so it takes away our manhood. It takes away our masculinity, because what we then conclude is, well, I must not be masculine if I got abused. When women are abused or girls are abused, their femininity isn't taken away. They still have their femininity. And so to lose your masculinity is a crucial piece of the damage that's done and the wounding and the questions about, so am I good enough? Am I strong enough? Am I powerful enough? The amount of denial that men have, I think, is much greater than women. And I think that men are much more likely to take responsibility for what was done to them than women do. Women in our society are taught that they could well be victims of sexual abuse, and we do all these things to prevent abuse from happening, from being done to girls, and we teach them about stranger danger, but we don't do the same things with boys, because the assumption is, boys don't get abused, so why would we teach them how to protect themselves? They already know how.
Yeah. And I think, I so appreciate what you're saying, even though, I mean, I've been in this for a while, I'm still seeing it clearer. Just hearing you say that for males, it's such a big part of their identity, like who they are supposed to be is approved gender, or, you know what I mean? Like that figure in the world, that if that's questioned through this act, then it rocks their world.
Yes, it does. And it causes, I think there's a lot more questioning about sexual orientation with male survivors also than there is with females. Since most females are abused by men, it doesn't cause them to think I'm not heterosexual if they're heterosexual. Now, if they're lesbian, that could certainly create some problems if they're abused by men or by women.
Yes.
If somebody is heterosexual and they're abused by a man, then they had any pleasure whatsoever, then again there begins to be that question of my masculinity.
Yeah.
Am I feminine? Am I gay? Which unfortunately are tied together, which is again a mistake and a misunderstanding about sexuality and sexual orientation.
Yeah.
If they're abused by women, and that's another important piece, is that a lot of guys are abused by women too, or only by women. And again, our society has this mistaken idea that women are always victims and men are always perpetrators. And that's another thing that creates so many more problems with male survivors, is that if they've been abused by women, it's much harder to talk about, there's much more shame about it, and there's much more denial within society. I mean, how many times have we heard about the female teacher who has sex, rapes their student, and there's not the same outrage as there is if it was a male teacher and a female student. Everybody goes, well, that's wrong. But if it's a young boy or an adolescent boy, then the teacher's forgiven. It's like, well, she cared about him, and it's this assumption that somehow he was giving consent when he couldn't give consent. He was groomed.
Exactly. Yeah, and the media doesn't help with this either, especially if the woman is, pretty or some stature, or, you know what I mean? Then they totally play it out.
It's a good teacher. Well, she was a good teacher. What, she couldn't possibly do that.
Yeah, exactly. Well, thank you. That was good to hear, and I appreciate that. And I know our audience, as you know, this probably comes as a question up for you in other circles as well. So, talk to me about, because we're talking about taking our power back, that we ultimately, I believe, we can heal, we can restore. The path to that, yes, is long and it takes time, but, group support. Talk to me about the dynamics of support groups and workshops and why that is so important for the healing.
The primary dynamic, the primary wound that's caused by sexual victimization, as we talked about already, is the betrayal of trust and shame. And so being with other survivors is critical to healing that shame, because men typically believe that it just happened, it was just done to me. See, I keep slipping. It was just done to me. That nobody else has experienced this. So to find out, to be in a room with other men who go, yes, I experienced the same thing, that was done to me too, is relieves so much shame. And when oftentimes men are not able to, as I said, it's difficult to, the common path is to take responsibility for what was done to you. Somehow it was my fault. But if you're in a room with other survivors and another survivor talks about how he's believing that it was his fault, in almost every case I've worked in, the other men in the group say, no, that wasn't your fault. You were 10 years old. You were 12. You were.
Yes.
They're so clear. They see it with everybody else, which is great, because then I can come back to them as a psychologist and go, now, wait a minute. You just said that John wasn't at fault and Bill wasn't at fault.
Yes.
And Paul wasn't at fault. So what about you? And if they struggle and go, yeah, but I'm different, then the other group members go, wait a minute. You're not any different than we are. And so you get through the denial that is really difficult to do individually, because if I say it as a therapist, well, you're just getting paid to say that. There's the lack of trust, there's that betrayal. that leads to them having difficulty believing that just because I say it, it must be so. It's still something very deep inside of them, and they need lots of help and lots of support, and that's why groups are so wonderful. The way that shame melts away when men are together is phenomenal, and that's the experience that men have when they come to our weekends of recovery that are sponsored by Male Survivor, is that they get to be in a room with 27 other men, and at first they think, I'm the weird one here. I'm the different one. Nobody else shares what I experienced. And through the course of the weekend, they find out there are lots of men who have experienced similar things and are struggling with similar after effects. It just decreases the shame so much. And then they have support. They have people they can reach out to for help.
Yeah, for the ongoing, Yes.
Right, because it's more than, what we tell people is this weekend's going to be powerful and helpful to you, but what's most important is not what happens between you here, it's what you do once you leave here.
Exactly.
Because many men come to the weekends really isolated and very alone, and that's the other power of being in a group, is that you're no longer alone.
Yeah.
You know you can reach out, and because of the bonding that they experience, they then do, in fact, reach out, even though it's feels like that phone's 100 pounds, they still pick it up.
Yeah, because they have that common bond. It's like going to war together. It's like you form a connection that, you can you can go back to it. You can recall it later.
That's
so
right.
Yeah, I love group work, and it was instrumental in my healing journey 20 years ago for exactly that reason. I'm a twin, and we were both abused, but still, I thought I was the only one. That's how profound and pervasive that thought is in isolating you in your shame. Right. So being in that group, like you said, hearing other women talk about things, and I was like, yeah, I can see how horrific that was, but in me, no, that wasn't so bad. It was back then. I'm fine now. So, and then learning over time to say the words, to own it, to code it, right? And then I could also watch with hope as other women were like, okay, so that's how you get over that. That's, the steps you need to take to get past this, and the safety of it. So I'm a huge fan of groups and a big believer. So that's why I really appreciate the work that you're doing with male survivors and those weekends. So
might just put in a plug for it while we're talking.
Yes, please do.
You just need to go to malesurvivor.org. Click on the first tab, which is Weekends of Recovery. They can find out all about our weekends. We have scholarships available to men who do not have financial resources, up to 75%. So it's relatively inexpensive.
That's great.
They're all over the country, so people can experience this kind of environment. We have days of recovery where people can come. We're doing one up in Silver Bay, New York, next weekend, in fact, on a Saturday. So there's lots of opportunities. If they just go to the website, they can learn about where we're going to be. We have openings for our one coming up in North Carolina next month in May. We have one in Connecticut in July. There's one in Alta, Utah in September, and one in Ohio, in Peebles, Ohio in October. So there's lots of opportunities to join us.
That's great. And you've clearly grown, and I've seen on your website all these different upcoming events. And I also know on your website you have a great number of resources for male survivors. And I know if someone reaches out to your organization, you will help them maybe get in touch with other local resources or organizations that are supportive of male survivors. So,
absolutely.
And I'm going to include a link underneath this video so people can, very quickly come find you. But I want to talk about your book. But before we do, I also want to just to touch upon some of the things that I think you teach or talk about in this weekend, the keys to thriving. We want to empower our listeners to learn and maybe start practicing some of these things. What I really love here is you have learning to be disloyal to dysfunction. Can you talk a little more about that?
Sure, sure. It's one of my favorite sayings that recovery is the process of learning to be disloyal to dysfunction and loyal to functionality.
Mm.
And so what we learn when we get abused is that we're supposed to be loyal to dysfunction and loyal to dysfunctional people,
Oh.
and then we're supposed to be disloyal to functionality, which is completely crossed. So that oftentimes in a dysfunctional family, as soon as you start to be functional, the family freaks out and they start to try to pull the person back in and say, no, 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 you have to be dysfunctional. You can't speak that truth. That's a lie, what you just said. You're being disloyal to us for saying that you were abused in this family. That's not right. So the challenge is to learn to be disloyal to dysfunction. And first you have to know, well, what does that mean? So it means things like believing that I didn't deserve to be protected, believing that another dysfunctional belief is believing that I'm an object and that my sole value of walking around this planet is to be a good sex object. Learning that I can't trust anybody because people will just hurt you if you get close to them. Those are a few examples of the kind of dysfunctional beliefs that we wind up learning through the process of being abused and the after effect of that. Learning to be loyal to functionality means that you challenge each of those dysfunctional beliefs and you're able to go, and then again, that's part of what's great about being in a group, is that it's so clear that if somebody else goes, I couldn't possibly tell somebody because they won't believe me, or they'll deny it or they'll minimize it. And of course, the people in the group go, well, we're not minimizing it, and what you're saying is real and it's painful and it was difficult for you. So it's the process of being loyal to functionality is about believing that I have a right to speak. I have a right to set boundaries. That's another one of those dysfunctional beliefs that I don't have any right to set a boundary, that I have to accept whatever's done to me, especially if somebody says I care, then obviously then they must have cared about me, so it must be okay. And it's like, no, it's not okay. If you are hurt by an experience with somebody else, that's not okay.
Yeah.
And you have a right to set a boundary and say, no, you can't do that to me anymore.
I love that. Yep. Makes sense. And I really appreciate how I'm sure there's some order to what you're teaching, but you start here and I can see the other steps that you talk about, and what piques my interest as the next one here is the exquisite compassion, because I'm a huge fan of self-love and self-care, and I think that's really how we get to feel safe, when we know who we are and we know that we can empower and take care of ourselves. Right. But exquisite compassion on a regular basis, what examples do you give to your male survivors around that?
Well, we actually have just started teaching about this in the level 1 introductory weekend of recovery. And it's a term I came up with because, we all now, it's so passé to say love yourself.
Yes,
right?
Yes.
And of course that's true. But what I realized is that it's now become so passé that people are not really taking it to heart. And so putting the word exquisite in front of it really emphasizes that this is not a luxury. And I think a lot of times in the self-help movement, we've come to think of loving yourself, that's kind of luxurious. It's not a luxury. It's really a necessity to be exquisitely compassionate. And that means being extra special gentle with yourself, because survivors are masters and mistresses of self-abuse and whipping themselves, saying like, oh, I was bad, I was wrong, I was stupid, I'm dumb, I made too much of it, I'm making a big deal about these things, and all those ways we beat ourselves up. And so to me, it's really important that we realize we're human. We make mistakes. Sometimes we use bad judgments. Sometimes we engage in self-destructive behavior. We have to take ownership of those mistakes that we make. And we have to offer ourselves compassion and recognize we did the best we could in that moment. And sometimes that caused us a lot of problems in our life, which, again, we have to own. But if we own it while at the same time beating ourselves up and telling ourselves how stupid we are and how dumb we are and how incompetent we are, I tell people, if really you could heal by beating yourself up, I'd put whips around my office and have people whip themselves for an hour. And then we'd be done with the session, And like, I'm sure that doesn't work. You know, and so the opposite of that is I'm going to treat myself gently. I'm going to love myself regularly. I'm going to exquisitely take care of myself. And when I'm tempted to beat myself up, I'm going to put the whip down and go, what can I do instead? And sometimes it means I have to reach out for help. That's part of exquisite compassion, is being willing to seek out community and to get the support that you need, and keep reminding yourself it's okay for me to ask for help. In fact, it's necessary. I cannot heal alone. As much as men especially believe and are taught that we should all be able to take care of ourselves when it comes to surviving and thriving with abuse, we have to have support. We have to reach out, and that's part of that exquisite compassion.
That's beautiful. I really love that. I'm going to make a note of that.
Please do.
Yes.
I hope the audience does.
Yes, I will. We'll have to.
Every time you're tempted to just, wait a minute, stop. Let's see if there's another option.
Exactly.
The other part of it is to identify our internal resources that we can use to be compassionate, and that includes reminding ourselves what our strengths are. Because if we have a strength like, I have an integrity and honesty, then sometimes I could ask that part of me to talk to me when I'm beating myself up, and go, okay, if that honest part of me was talking to me, what would it say right now? It would say, Howard, you're a great guy, and yeah, you made a mistake, and you can forgive yourself. It's all right. And we can use a resource of somebody else in our life who's been a mentor to us, who's taught us about love and care, and we could reach out to them either in our heads or actually, and have them talk to us. Or we might use some kind of transpersonal mentor or guide, whether that's a higher power or God or Buddha or a tree that's in your neighborhood, or just community. It's something outside of yourself.
Yes.
And when we allow ourselves to know that all those resources can speak to us and help us when we're struggling.
Yes.
That's another part of exquisite compassion.
Oh, that's beautiful. I love how, the samples that you're giving us, and, yes, we need outside people, connections to, I think, reaffirm our goodness, but I like what you said, to go inside and speak to those strengths that you already have, because I think so much of our journey is to reconnect with who we really are and the good things about us. And once we connect with those, again, it's all along I knew I was a pretty good person. I just had cut up myself off from that, but keep revisiting and reconnecting to those pieces. So thank you for sharing that.
Sure.
So your book, what do you hope men and women can learn from reading your book? Is it a workbook? Is it a reading? Can people use it as a tool?
It is a workbook, a tool.
Yes. Okay.
It's called Joining Forces, Empowering Male Survivors to Thrive.
Yes.
And in every chapter, I have exercises and questions at the end, and affirmations at the end of each one. I really believe a lot in the power of affirmations, of just telling ourselves different statements about ourselves than those dysfunctional things that we've told ourselves. There's lots of stories in there from male survivors about their experience and what's worked for them. So my hope with the book is that people will read it, take every tool they can from it that makes sense to them, and use those tools to realize that even if you're only thriving 10% today, it's that's thriving. And if tomorrow it's 12, well, that's thriving too. And if you get to be 50, 60, 70, 80, whatever it is, it's we're not going for 100. We're just increasing our ability to be more functional and more effective and more loving and caring and more productive in our work and in our lives.
Yeah.
And our relationships.
And every day is a new day. It's a clean slate.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
That's beautiful. Well, I want to ask one more question, but before I do, I do hope our audience comes and visits you at your website, howardfradkin.com, and of course, malesurvivors.org. They can, join and find you in both places and all the resources that you've mentioned, and to learn more about the male survivor support groups, and find any other additional resources that could be helpful to men and their families, probably.
Absolutely, yes. We have a whole bulletin board on the Male Survivor website, so people, if they're family members, if they're military, if they're wives or spouses, I mean, there's little categories for each kind of group to be able to come together. There's parts on the website that are just for gay men or for men who might call themselves queer or transgender. There's just, for every different kind of male survivor there's resources there. There's books. There's a link for Find Support, where we list both our support groups as well as therapists that they can find in their area. So yeah, there are lots of help.
That's beautiful. Well, thank you. But I wanted to ask you, just to leave our audience, if there's just one thing a male survivor or a woman or even a professional that's listening to this, what's the key thing you want them to know about how to best help and support a male survivor, or what they can do to empower themselves?
The biggest thing I want to say is that recovery is absolutely possible and achievable. Because a lot of times men and women get so down and recovery is so tough that they can lose sight of that. So I think that's the biggest thing. Recovery is absolutely possible and achievable, and thriving is absolutely possible and achievable.
Well, thank you, Howard, for saying that, because, I'm here because I believe in that. I wouldn't be here if I hadn't gone through the journey, and I know you believe that because you feel that in your own life you have survived and are thriving and paying it forward. And just as an example, I mean, you shared your story in the beginning of your own abuse, and I really appreciate you being so open and vulnerable about that. But as you noticed, I didn't dwell on it.
Right.
I didn't go into it. I just thank you, because I honor and celebrate that strength in you that's now become probably a strength that you utilize in your teaching and helping others. And very much when I work with people, we don't dwell so much on what happened, other than how does it show up today, and how can we change those thoughts and beliefs so you don't continue carrying them into the future. So I think we did a good job modeling here in our dialogue. Yes, it's a tough subject, but we can talk about it frankly with open hearts and talk about solutions. And I absolutely believe we can heal. So.
Absolutely, and thank you for also honoring me with your story as well.
Thank you. Thanks, Howard. Well, I want to remind our audience again one more time, visit malesurvivor.org or howardfradkin.com. I will put the links underneath this video, and go check out all those resources. And you can purchase Howard's book, Joining Forces, Empowering Male Survivors to Thrive. Is it on Amazon or sold?
Or through Hay House, yeah.
Okay, great. And I'm sure they can also find it through your website.
Yeah.
Okay, great. And again, if you are here listening to the summit, remember to check in your email box again tomorrow for 2 more expert interviews. And I want to thank you for listening today and spend this really beautiful moment with Howard sharing his important work with male survivors. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Svava.